Abel and Cain did the wrong thing. And I think what we fail to understand is that Abel made, the Hebrews were supposed to sacrifice both. It wasn't God deciding, I like animal sacrifices, I don't like sacrifices of grains and oils. The difference was, what are you willing to sacrifice for me? How much are you willing to sacrifice for me? And Abel Cain was too self-centered. Abel gave willingly of his bounty. And when Cain decides that he's not willing to make that kind of sacrifice, make that kind of effort to please God, then instead of deciding, I will make this sacrifice, I will turn this over to God, he decides to tear Abel down instead, because Abel it is a jealousy thing, but it's also this is my competition, I can get rid of it.
All right. Yes.
So in the Galatians 4 one, the verse right above it is talking about being kind of led astray about believing in different gods, multiple gods, and then it kind of reverts back talking about these elemental principles. And I think that for a lot of people, they knew that someone had to create all these things, but they didn't necessarily know who the one true God was. And so they kind of fell into, people coming up with ideas of how, well, it must be a God and it's responsible for these things. And so they didn't really know who the one true God was, but they knew, just like the song that heaven declared, that they could tell that something created everything. But they kind of got it off a little bit by thinking that there were multiple gods that did. So I think, just a handful of verses that talk about these elemental principles of nature. I think that sometimes it looks like it's focusing on polytheism, but other times I think that it's actually maybe talking about the law. And so I think sometimes Paul uses it to represent a couple of different things. The Colossians 1 and 2a, it's talking about being captive through philosophy and conception. So there's some ideas that are being presented that are incorrect. And I feel like that's the thing that he's trying to talk about. But it's not, I don't feel like it's really easy to nail down one thing. I feel like sometimes it kind of hints at maybe multiple gods, people are misunderstood, other times it's the law, different things like that.
Okay. Yeah, Marty.
In the NIV, it uses the phrase spiritual forces instead of principles or something like that. And I was just curious, after my Greek New Testament, if that word might be in Ephesians 6, where it talks about the powers and principalities in the air,
Yeah.
that there were spiritual forces in the world that were against God.
Yes. Okay. To Justin's point, there's really nothing dogmatic that we can say. We can say, here's what I think based on the text, but like you said, there's not a definite conclusion to it. But I think we can get some application for our lives in this particular passage. And to Marty's point, the basic principles of this world have forces behind them, personalities, real beings behind them. In other words, when you're dealing with false teaching and principles, humanism that man has made up, to get us out of the mess we're in. Human beings we got a lot of problems. We're a mess. And so people look for avenues, philosophies, things that can get us out of that, and there are forces behind that. They're not just abstract principles that we pull out of the air. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, the Spirit says that in latter times, people will depart from the faith and submit to teaching of demons. And he says these teachings, in verse 2 of 1 Timothy 4, these teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. They teach people not to marry, they refuse people the right to marry, and to abstain from certain foods. So he gives two specific examples of those teachings. And he says they're demonic in their origin. And they come through people. So there are spiritual forces at work in every false teaching. Demonic. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says we know that idols don't mean anything. There's nothing behind them. There's no reality. There's no real God behind them. But he says what? There is a power and there is a force at work there when people go into temples and worship idols. What force or power does he say is at work? Demons. Demonic forces. Evil personalities. And so this is, to Marty's point, in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul says our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against what? Ephesians 6 and verse 12. Against spiritual forces, against heavenly beings in spiritual realms, he says. The first century world were smarter than the 21st century Americans because they actually believed in the spiritual world, the metaphysical world. We don't believe in that world. Really. We think it's more just cerebral, mental. People have a mental disease. They have a mental defect. We think that's the cause of why people act so cruel and malicious and evil. That's our way of explaining it. But the Bible says, no, that's not totally, it's not just having to do with your mind and being psychologically upset. There are other things behind this. And you have to pull back, the Bible, what it does is pull back the curtain for us and give us a glimpse into this other realm that really exists. But it's a realm of the unseen. And occasionally it breaks out and does some horrific things that we're at a loss to explain. Like, how do you explain a human being walking into a school of innocent children with a gun and mowing children down? How do you explain that as just a mental illness? That's unspeakable evil, horror. And the Bible deals with that and explains it to us. So I think when you look at that elemental spirits, you have to look at that aspect of it as well. It's not just a philosophy or a tradition or a line of thinking, a line of reasoning. It's got something else behind it. Verse 8, look, I think verse 8 has to be included in your interpretation of what he's talking about. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. So he's speaking of their background, wasn't it? I think Justin delved a little bit about it there. They were worshiping gods. And in the ancient world, you had a hierarchy. You had a supreme God, but he kind of had a lot of lieutenants, and you couldn't get to him. There was a lot of intermediaries you had to go through. There were angels. Angels were intermediaries. You saw those mentioned in Colossians 2. There were angels that were intermediaries. There was a whole pantheon of gods. You had the god of storms, and you had the god of the sun, and you had the god of, they tried to, and the stars. I was reading a survey the other day, when we think that this is just first century superstition. The latest survey I've seen said 48% of Americans who were surveyed believe that astrology has something to do with everyday life. The stars, the planets, how they align. And that eclipse we had was a religious experience for a lot of people. Not in terms of our God, the God that we saw that created that, but in terms of the planets being aligned. And I had some friends in the media business that wouldn't do certain things until they consulted their astrology guide or their astrologist. And we've had presidents like that. So that's still around, folks. That's still around. And what drives human beings to do that, I think, a lot of times is I'm scared of the future. What's coming? I don't know what's coming. How do I prepare for that? How do I get a glimpse into that? Get some understanding? Because I feel insecure. And human beings are hungry and thirsting to know that. And Paul gives a brilliant argument for the Lord Jesus Christ over all of that in Colossians chapters 2 and 3. He said, you don't have to worry about those forces and powers that are at work in the world. You don't have to worry about the planets lining up. You don't have to worry about the stars. Because Jesus, chapter 1 of Colossians and verses 16 and 17, he made it. He designed it. He's in control of it. Don't worry. Just stay focused on him. And the Galatians had taken their focus off Jesus and put it on something else. And whatever you focus most on in life is how you're going to turn out. You focus on Christ, you'll find yourself being slowly, it's a process of growth. You'll be rid of your fears. You'll be starting to be more confident in the future. You'll be more secure in your own being. You'll be more attentive, more loving to the needs of others. Christ turns you into that kind of person. On the other hand, if your focus is elsewhere, you become more fearful, more anxious, more irritable, more edgy. And that's the case with the Galatians. In the middle of chapter 4, you remember he tells them, what happened to your joy? You used to have a lot of joy. What happened to that? And in chapter 5, he says, now you're biting and devouring one another. In a spiritual sense. Okay, so now in Colossians, the latter part of Colossians 4, beginning in verse 26, he starts forming this argument for them. about identity, who they are. And who are they now? Who are the Galatian churches? Chapter 3, verse 26. And what are you by faith? Free, but a son. Yeah, you're sons and daughters now. See, God justified you and redeemed you in order to what? Adopt you into His family. You've been adopted. Now, people will say, well, I thought I was born into God's family, you know. You know what adoption is, don't you? Adoption is what? Yeah. They weren't in your family previously, but you bring them into your family through in most countries, through a legal act. They were orphans. They had a mom and daddy, but who knows what happened to them, you know? Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. But you're brought out of one family of origin and you're brought into another family by the gracious act of somebody. You know, a gracious mom, and that's what God has done for us. Now, there's other places in the Bible that tells us we're born into God's family. And here it tells us we're adopted. Which is it? It's both. It's both. It depends on what purpose that Paul is dealing with, where he'll use one metaphor or one illustration or another. You were born into God's family through the truth. James 1:18, 1 Peter 1:22. God put His seed in you, and in Jesus' words, in John 3, you were born from where? Above. You were born again. Born into God's family. But here, when he's dealing with adoption, he's dealing with what? Your inheritance. How did you come into this inheritance that you're going to get? That you're receiving now, and you'll receive more of it. And that's what he's dealing with here. Your inheritance. You are an heir because you've been adopted. You're going to inherit something. You're already inheriting certain things, but the best is yet to come. The Bible calls that glorification. One day you'll be glorified with Jesus in God's presence. So you're heirs. Now, that's the analogy he carries all the way through chapter 4. You're a child and an heir if you're in Christ. Whereas if you go under these elemental principles, if you go under these gods that are not gods again, if you go under the law, the Jewish law, you become what? You're still a child, and you're going to stay a child. Isn't that what he says in the first part of chapter 4? Look at that. He says, what I'm saying is that as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. He is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were children, we were in slavery. Once a child, always a child if you're not in Christ. You'll stay under elemental principles. You'll be treated just like a child. These gods that you serve and these principles you serve, you're a slave to them. And they're a hard taskmaster. Now for Jews, They were under slavery to what? The law, the Mosaic law. That was their taskmaster. For Gentiles, who most of these guys were in Galatians, they were a slave to what? Sin. And that sin took its, so were Jews, but that sin took its form in these basic principles or elemental things. Whether it was worshiping the stars or the elements, air, earth, water, fire. Those were the four principal elements in the first century world. And they all had a god. He said, air had a god? Paul identifies the God of the air, doesn't he, in Ephesians 2. Who is the God of the air? Satan. Paul correctly identifies him in Ephesians 2. He's the God of the air. He's in the atmosphere. If you want to locate him, he's there. Okay, so how does he do it? So he's got this child illustration, and he's going to carry it all the way through chapter 4. Now the Jews under the law were saying, what counts is who's your daddy? Who's your father, spiritually? And they said, if you're under the law, it's Abraham, wasn't it? You had to be able to trace your ancestry back to Abraham. And if you couldn't do that, if you weren't born a Jew, then you had to be what? Circumcised. That puts you into the spiritual family of Abraham, circumcision. And Paul says, it's not who's your daddy. It's who's your mother. Because watch here. In chapter 4, verse 25, look at what he says. Who's your mother? Chapter 4, verse 25. Now Hagar stands. We'll come back to who this Hagar is. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia. What's the significance of this mountain? It's where the law was given. Mount Sinai. Not in the Promised Land, in Arabia. Mount Sinai in Arabia. And corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem. Present city of Jerusalem, first century, was under what? The Mosaic Law. Because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free. And she is who? Our mother. She is our mother. The Jerusalem that's above is our mother, and that's what counts. Who's your mama? Spiritually. Not who's your daddy spiritually, but who's your mama. And you know, Paul carries that illustration all the way through, beginning in verse 12 of chapter 4. He starts pleading with them as a mother pleads with her children. You ever seen a mama trying to persuade one of her children? This one's not working. The switch is not working. So she sits down and she looks that child in the eye and she says, please, I'm begging you, listen to me. I care so deeply about you. I love you so much. And that's what the apostle does, beginning in verse 12. In fact, he likens himself to a woman bearing children. Did you see that illustration? Look at chapter 4 and verse, 19. My dear children. That's the only time he uses that phrase in any of his letters. My dear little ones. It's a term that a mother would use when she's got the face of her child just cupped into her hands and just talking to them, pleading with them. Now, the Apostle John uses it all the time, doesn't he? If you go through 1 John, my little children, my little children. John was a big mama guy, you know. He had the tenderness of a mother. And you don't see that often from Paul. Paul's more like the father, you know. But he says, my dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth. I'm like a woman trying to birth a child. Till Christ is formed in you. And that's Paul's whole objective. He doesn't want their money. He doesn't want their applause. He doesn't want their accolades. He doesn't want their attaboys. All he wants is what? For Jesus Christ to be formed in them. Now, what mom and daddy don't want their child to turn out good? You want your child to turn out right. You want your child to turn out good. And that's good, but it's not enough. You don't want your kids just to be moral. You want them to be Christ-like. You want Christ to be formed in them. Otherwise, all you got is morality. And that's just, one step up from legalism. Because why be moral? Why be good? What's the motivation for a Christian? Jesus Christ loved me and gave himself for me. That's why I'm good. That's why I want to be moral and good. He's my motivation. The love of Christ constrains me because I'm convinced that one died for all and therefore all died. And he died for all so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them. Who said that? And where is that? 2 Corinthians 5. And he says the same thing in Galatians 2:20, doesn't he? I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. That's what is the key for Christ being formed in you. That's the motivation. And that's what you want to tell your kids. Do it because Christ loves you and gave his life for you. That's why you clean up your room. That's why you do the dishes. Explain that to them. Because that's the difference between just being moral and being a Christian. Being Christ-like. That motivation has to be at the center of whatever we do. And that's why the gospel is so important. It places that motivation at the very center of your heart, and your mind, and your soul, and your life. So you see, he's carrying that illustration all the way through chapter 4. It's who your mother. And your mother is the new Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that's born from God and not from men's traditions and men's teachings and men's philosophy. This is the Jerusalem that's from above. Now, he quotes the Old Testament, doesn't he, to back up his claim here. And it's Isaiah 54. And I want you to turn there. We may not get this finished, so I may have you read for this week's assignment Isaiah 53 and 54. But I want you to turn to Isaiah 54 because he's using it to talk about our mother. Isaiah 54, beginning in verse 1. Is everybody tracking with me? He says, "Sing, O barren woman." That's the least thing you wanted to do if you were a woman in that time. You couldn't bear children, is sing. You were depressed. And he's talking to God's people here as a whole. He's likening them to a woman who sees no future. They're in captivity. They see no future, no hope of ever being a people, a nation. Sing, O barren woman, you who never bore a child. Burst into song, shout for joy, you who were never in labor. Because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. Here's the natural means of getting pregnant, and here's the supernatural means. And that's what he's contrasting in Galatians 4. The supernatural is born from the promise of God. That was Sarah. Hagar had a child of natural means from Abraham, and which turned out the free child, and the free woman, and which turned out the slave child and the slave woman. Okay, so he goes on. Verse 2 and 3, he says, what I want you to do is get rid of that old tent. You know, that's where they lived in. Get rid of that old tent, woman, because you're about to have more kids than you know what to do with. So he says, enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch your tent curtains wide. Don't hold back. Lengthen the cords and strengthen the stakes. You're going to be bursting at the seams because you've got so many children in this tent that the tent can't hold them. It's going to be beyond what you can imagine or dream. And this is the barren woman now that's going to have this family. You know, and Sarah is a perfect example. She had her first kid, and then boom, that kid had what? Descendants that were like what? The stars in the sky and the sands of the seashore. From that one thing. We got a big God. That's why we can dream big, you know. So the barren woman's going to have she's not going to believe the family she's going to have. And God is telling these people, look, I know you're in captivity. Your temple is devastated. You're devastated. You think there's no future. But listen, you can't believe I've got the future I've got in store for you. Okay? You will spread out to the right and the left. Your descendants will dispose of nations and settle in their desolate cities. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You're not going to suffer shame. You don't have to fear disgrace. You're not going to be humiliated. And that's what it was in that time, not to have children. You were just under the disfavor of God, under the curse of God. And you're going to remember no more the reproach of your widowhood. Why? Verse 5. Here's the key right here. You got a new husband. Who's your husband? Not Abraham. your Maker. He's your husband. Your Maker is a husband. The Lord Almighty. That's who your husband is now. And Jesus said of your husband, God, in Matthew 3, he says, when he was speaking through John the Baptist says, don't say to yourself, Abraham is our father, because God can do what? He can raise up children from what? These stones. That's what God can do. Okay. The Lord will call you back as if you were a wife deserted. You got a husband. Now you switch to an illustration of a deserted wife. She's been deserted because of her sin and her rebellion. That he goes on to say, but now I'm going to take you back and we're going to build this new Jerusalem with a lot of kids. And if you notice in verse 11 and going on down to verse 12, you've got quotes there from the book of Revelation. Or rather, Revelation, John quotes this section in describing our new Jerusalem. The city that is to come. Now, what's going to bring about all these kids and all this offspring? How can God do this with a sinful people? How can he adopt people that are guilty, that deserve his punishment, his wrath? Go back to chapter 53. Because there he talks about the death of the Messiah. And I want you to notice this phrase here that he uses. Chapter 53, verse 10. We're still in Isaiah, and we're going to close on this because we're almost out of time. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, that is the Messiah, Jesus, and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, or a sin offering, he, that is God, will see his, that is the Messiah's, what? There. Offspring. The death of the Messiah is going to make possible us becoming God's children, the offspring. His offspring, born from above, born of God. God justified us and redeemed us so he could make us his children. And we're free because of that. Therefore, we don't want to go back under bondage. Okay, we're going to finish up chapter 4 next week. So read the book of Galatians at least through once. Read it twice. The more you read it, the more it'll get into you. And that's the whole point, so that Christ can be formed in you. Okay? Thank you for your attention and your participation.